I will start with introductions, I guess, closest to me. This is Senate Pro Tem David Sokola. I was just trying to think the last time we spoke. It might have been 2017 or so during a brief interview. It's been a while. But on cheat sheets here it says you've represented the Newark area for 35 years. This is your 35th year. You've helped pass marriage equality. You've pushed for education, environmental laws. And next week, you'll begin your 5th session as leader in the Senate. Is that correct? Thank you. Senator Sokola. Next on the list, we have House Minority Whip Jeff Spiegelman. And Representative Spiegelman has served in the House since 2012, if that's correct, representing the Clayton area. And you're a commercial realtor, and you've been an important voice, I think it's fair to say, on small business issues in the legislature.
Are you asking me or are you telling me?
I think I'm being so bold to say to tell you that.
Okay,
I think.
okay.
Yeah.
It all sounds good then.
Yeah, great. You were recently elected House Minority Whip alongside Minority Leader Tim Dukes. And next on the list is our next on the list is our House Speaker, Melissa Minor Brown. Representative Minor Brown, you were elected in 2018, I believe, representing Newcastle area.
Yes.
Yeah. You're a registered nurse, and you've pushed several healthcare policies during your time here, I believe. When you were elected in November as House Speaker, you were the first person of color to hold that post.
Yes. Thank you.
And last but not least is Senator Eric Buckson. You have served since 2012. Is that correct?
Well, no.
That is not correct.
2022.
I'm sorry, 2022. Can't tell. There you are. There you are. Thank you. Thank you. Both our Senate Minority Leader and the Whip couldn't make it today, and so they elected Senator Buckson to
They allowed the JV to show up.
I think it's fair to say that you've been an important voice. You've been a strong voice for the Republican membership there in the legislature.
I think my colleagues will agree I have been a voice.
Yeah, there you go.
You define whether it was strong or not, but it was a voice.
Being a voice is important, I would say. You are a retired Polytech school teacher.
Yes.
That's correct?
Yes.
And you currently serve on the JFC, the Joint Finance Committee, which is an incredibly powerful committee in the legislature.
Yes.
So that is our panel of 4 legislators, and I'm excited to hear from them. So I'm going to throw some questions your way, and the first one may be most important. It's the one that people focus on often, and that's the budget. And this morning, we heard from land use experts, we heard from education advocates, both of whom said we need more money. And there have been calls for more money, especially in education, especially with teacher salaries for starting teachers. There's also a proposal for a parking garage and tunnel potentially to the legislature, to the legislative house that will cost $150 million. There are these costs. At the same time, I believe DFAC is showing that revenue growth, the growth rate is slowing for fiscal years 26 and 27. How do you square that? Is there going to be a tax increase this year? Whoever wants to start.
You want me to go first?
Sure,
Okay.
you're closest. So
I actually serve on DFAC, the Delaware Financial Advisory Council. We do the projections for revenues. There's just over 24 lines of revenue that we review each time we meet, which is 5 times a year or so. And we are very careful to not over-project. And so that's why when we met in October, there was about $229 million more for FY26. We're halfway through fiscal year 25 now. And so we projected another 220 some million at that point. We met again in December, and there's another 160 or so million. So roughly $400 million change of money to work with for the next fiscal year. The real number I like to look at is the benchmark. And the benchmark has three components to it. The benchmark is what we can increase our budget by, unless the legislature agrees to go higher or lower. And the benchmark has personal income, population, and something they call the deflator, which is, you know what the CPI is, that's the Consumer Price Index, and that's what they change Social Security benefits by every year. Well, the deflator is a government spending thing, and government spends money on teaching, and the number of teachers can go up. The number of special ed teachers can go up by a greater number than, or a greater percentage. And so there's a number of areas of government spending that go into that. And when you put those three together, as of December, the deflator number was 5%. And so if with only the existing revenues that are projected, if we went to that 98%, Delaware has a 98% rule, we would have 5% of that we can go, and you put that all together, and there would still be about 300 and some million of what they call extraordinary revenues. And that's not touching the reserve fund, and it's also not touching the rainy day fund, which has never been touched in 45 years since it was first established during Pete DuPont's term. So, you know, it's something that it's very important to see if those trends are starting to come down. But we've been hearing every year I've been on DFAC that the revenues are going to be going down, and for some reason they just haven't started going down. The growth has been fairly constant, maybe a little less, but we do have some things that we can't project money for yet. Like, for instance, there's hydrogen hub money that's coming both to Chemours and to Bloom, and possibly to other companies that are working together in that space. And once there are jobs in that area, then we can consider the tax revenue from those jobs for that. And it includes not just the jobs, but if there's construction or something, those jobs will add income tax. So I am somebody who's cautiously optimistic that we're going to be able to handle those needs that are being talked about. And I'm hopeful that the incoming governor, who has said some states have seen up to a 5% reduction when they've done efficiency studies, which we do periodically, and he said it's my 35th year. We've done a few of these in the past. I think that's an ambitious amount, but I'm hopeful that, yeah, we can get 5% from efficiencies. That would be great. And that would make some of these other needs that we're doing a little more easy to make.
And those are efficiencies you think that can be achieved in the next fiscal year?
I don't know. I mean, I'm waiting to see. You know, I think it's important. I worked 34 years in the lab at DuPont, and an important part of science is being skeptical. But it's not the same thing as being ideological. So, you know, I want to give people a fair shot. I know Matt did a pretty good job doing the finances in Newcastle County, and I'm cautiously optimistic that he's going to be able to bring some of those successes to the state government, and hopeful that we are successful in that area.
So just to wrap, I mean, it's fair to say you don't anticipate a significant tax increase during this, for the 2026 fiscal year, is that fair?
Not necessarily a tax increase. The other thing he's talked about is tax restructuring, so that the top rate, instead of being $60,000, would be $125,000. When I was first elected, the top rate started at $40,000 of income, and we had what was called a marriage tax penalty. So if two people were married and they both made $40,000 of income, you paid the top rate on $40,000. Now, if two people are married and they make an adjusted gross income of $60,000, you don't pay a nickel on at the top rate, which is now 6.6%. It was 7.9% in 1990. So, and there are more things you can deduct now. There's other things that factor into that. So, you know, we've come down a little below where we are now. We've come back to 6.6% as the top rate. Let's see, New Jersey has a $500,000 tax, and Maryland has a millionaire tax. Pennsylvania has flat tax. So, you know, you kind of got to consider what space you're in and who your neighbors are and what they're doing when you make these decisions, because you're not doing them in a vacuum.
And just on that point that you're making, if there was a restructuring of the upper tax brackets, would that be revenue neutral? Do you anticipate that? Or would that be a tax increase itself?
It could be
It could be
revenue neutral, it could be a tax increase, it
Okay.
could be a
Those
tax
conversations
reduction.
haven't happened yet.
Those conversations have to occur.
Gotcha. I appreciate it. Representative Spiegelman, do you want to
Sure,
address
thank
the
you.
same question?
So we've breached $5 billion. The budget does go up every year. You know, we have what we call door openers, which are things that automatically we have to pay for. We have to pay, and the largest piece of our budget is healthcare, and then we have healthcare obligations that we have to pay for. But we've breached $5 billion at this point. I'm happy that you say that it's. Excuse me. I'm happy that you say that we're allowed to be skeptical, because I'm a bit skeptical because of some of these long-term commitments that we have. I'd like to see us get on top of these long-term commitments a little bit more, especially long-term commitments in healthcare, more preventative care, things like that. We do need to make investments in healthcare now in order to prevent healthcare costs into the future, and that's a tough thing to do. I mean, it's an extremely tough thing to do. I don't want to step in that too much. This is not my expertise. I'll let the nurse talk about that a little bit more than the commercial realtor. But one of the cool things about right now is, for the first time, at least in my memory, the incoming governor is not somebody who has really any sort of connections to Dover. Right? This is the first governor that I can remember who hasn't served in a position in Dover or statewide. So it's a real kind of an outsider point of view. Who's taking over the budget from a governor who took over from a governor who took over from a governor who took over from a governor who was more of what we would call a Dover insider, or at least served at the state level in some capacity. For those of you who don't know, and forgive me for lecturing, that the budgetary process is collaborative between the governor's recommended budget and what the General Assembly, who ultimately controls the purse strings, does. And so with this incoming governor, the real answer to your question is how an outsider governor, I don't say that as a bad thing, like an outsider versus an insider, but how an outsider governor who's going to have a new finance director, a new OMB director, with a new speaker, with a new majority leader, with all of these new things, how these new components are going to fit in what is our constitutional obligation to balance the budget, both now and into the future. And that's really the answer to your question. I realize it's more nebulous than the exact answers that President Pro Tempore gave, but that interplay is going to really dictate whether or not there's a tax increase.
Well, looking at that, I mean, do you have an anticipation, do you have a prediction on the answer to that question, on that interplay? Will it turn out?
You have a coin? You have a coin?
I mean, we're looking at projections. It's not, there is information, there's data that can fuel your prediction.
And in 46 minutes and 50 some odd seconds, Governor Meyer's going to be here. I'm not even totally sure Governor Meyer knows at this point what the budget, because he's working off of Governor Carney's last year's budget and he can modify it a little bit, but then the following year's budget is going to be completely a Meyer budget. You got a coin? Flip it. One thing I do want to address, the parking garage and tunnel.
Sure.
So the parking garage and tunnel is a bit of a interesting bipartisan supported and bipartisan opposed thing right now. Our building is too small. It's too small. The parking around the building is inadequate. So what do you do? Yeah, I mean, there's a very expensive parking garage that is on the table. The tunnel was there because the crossing from the parking garage into the General Assembly is treacherous at best. And you know that for anybody who parks along that side of the building, backing up and not getting run over is very difficult. So, do we continue to have a building that's too small with inadequate parking, or do we spend $150 million on a parking garage and not have the tunnel there and have somebody get run over there, and then it comes back on us, but then if somebody doesn't get run over there, then the tunnel is a gigantic waste of money.
Understood.
I don't know what to tell you. And that is, so far, actually, interestingly, within my caucus, we don't have an official position on this because we're kind of split. Some people say parking garage, some people say no parking garage, some people say tunnel, some people say no tunnel, some people say do nothing, some people say, oh my God, do anything. That's my official stance.
Understood.
I don't know how to spell that.
I'm going to keep moving on. I think your colleagues addressed the question, but if either of you would like to, or we can move on to the next one, which I would address to you too. But.
Is an acceptable answer.
No. So because you mentioned the tax increases first, and I know that that is a hot topic right now amongst Delawareans, and it is concerning. I think that, well, we've all been elected into this space, right? And our constituents are relying on us to do the best we can to kind of help people stay above water right now at a time when people are really, really concerned. And it's also a time when we need to really prioritize being extremely fiscally responsible, right? So we need to pay attention to some of the legislation that we're working on, right? Like we need to think about some of the money that we're spending, how we're spending it, where we're spending it, and what is the domino effect from the money that we're spending. I think, were you getting ready to say something?
I was just going to ask for whether or not there are any specific projects that you're looking at that you don't think we should be spending on.
Well,
have you been, I imagine you've been looking at that, and
I
have you come to any
you're
conclusions
really
about
good
it?
at your job, but I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay.
But what I will say is, for now, I'll just talk about the fact that people are struggling right now, right? So we need to look at how we're 20,000 affordable housing units short in our state, right? So how do we make sure that people can afford to live, right? How do we make sure, look at our healthcare costs, right? We're one of the top in the country, and we're not, I mean, our healthcare outcomes do not coincide or complement the healthcare costs. That's a problem. So like my colleague here said, looking at prevention, focusing on prevention is a big deal. We'll have to dump money into that to win on the back end, right? We have to ensure people have affordable child care. We have to make sure that people can afford health care, quality health care. We have to make sure that people are working in jobs where they can afford to live. So when we think about all of that, we have to comb through and look at where we're spending our money. And I mean, I'll bring this up, for example. We need to look at our grant and aid process, right? Let's make sure that we are putting our money into organizations that are functioning and doing the work that needs to be done if they're receiving money from the state. I know that that hasn't been looked at in a very long time, and it's something that is being brought up often. And I get it, that is fiscal responsibility, or else it's just gonna be a vicious cycle. We need to make sure we are still putting money into our rainy day fund. So I think just taking a holistic approach to this and making sure that we are really, I mean, we can pass a ton of bills that cost a ton of money and everybody gets a win in their own way. But is Delaware really winning if we're broke and now we have to raise taxes? No, we're not. So I think it's just about taking that holistic approach to look at where we can put money into areas that will uplift Delawareans and just lighten their load.
Understood. That leads to several of my follow-up questions, but
So
I'll let Senator
real
Buckson.
quick. And I got a
Jump in
clock here,
first.
so hold me to it in 2 minutes' time. First of all, I will tell you what I think, not necessarily what I know, right? I respect the folks that I'm in front of right now. Many of you smarter than I am by far. I'll tell you what I think right now, and that is that Delaware right now, and I replaced a senator who had never voted on the budget during his tenure. And then I come in, get assigned to the Joint Finance Committee, and vote in favor of it. I did so because I spent 16 years at the levy court where we did the JFC ourselves, right? And I came in at a time, 2007, when we were facing a real financial crisis. And what I decided to do, because I wasn't an expert, is to do it like I would if I switched chairs with you. What would I do if it was my household budget? I have to separate the wants from the needs, and I got to decide what is it that is in our household right now that is bleeding us out, that isn't effective. And then what is it that we need today, tomorrow, and next year that I can match with revenues that I expect? Because if I can't, then the answer has to be no. So I'll end with this, and it's very important because excellent explanations. I think what the question was is, are we going to raise taxes on the folks that we're sitting in front of right now? And my response is no, not until we put everything on the table, examine everything that we're currently spending on, and decide what needs to go. Decide where we can do what you would do, cut our household budget. That doesn't mean that you cut to the bone social programs, education, other things. There's fat in our budget. There just has to be. And lastly, in the last 30 seconds, why did I vote in favor of the last two budgets? at the risk of, running an offense of some of my constituents. It was because during the last 2 years, there were necessary level ups that we had to do for some important programs, like staff, like our state employees, like our social programs, our healthcare programs. There was a necessity to match what was going on with the country. And it would have done me no good to sit there and simply say no.
Let me ask the same question.
But that won't happen again.
Let me ask the same question I threw towards the speaker. You've been here for 2 years. What have you seen? Where is the fat that you have seen during your time here? What would you cut?
So I think what we focused on mainly is trying to keep up with healthcare costs and leveling up our teachers' salaries and improving some of our infrastructure. So we've had to focus on that at a time when we've had extraordinary revenues. We're in a good space right now. So there hasn't been a lot of focus or necessity to focus on making difficult decisions. But I suspect it's coming. The DFAC has put out numbers. I thought it was going to be this year. It appears it isn't. But the following year, I think growth is going to be down to less than 2%. If that happens in the next year, now we're getting into real conversations. So for me to say specifically this, and this, I can offer one up, and I don't mean to keep putting my hand in front of you. I'm sorry about that. But my wife would look at me like this and go, "What are you doing?" But here's
I'm not going to say, if I smack it, that means I have a problem. You're fine.
It's all good. I
Can I?
got you. It would be really simple to say this. Look at what's out there, right, that maybe we haven't looked at in the past, that looks really good on paper, that we're funding and continue to fund, but have never really taken a hard look to say, it looks good on paper, we're paying all this, they're producing a real sound fiscal audit, but are we asking them to produce a performance audit? Because performance is where it's at. That's what we want.
Are you thinking of something in particular right now?
Well, now you ask me to dime folks out, but I do believe that conversation needs to be had, and it would be disingenuous, unfair for me to start labeling into specific things. One example, and I'll end with this, as a classroom educator, if you think that paying teachers more is going to cure the problems in our educational system, you'll be back at the table years from now. It will not cure what's going on in our classrooms, and that's a real challenge. And chasing other states' models, think about it, $15 an hour. $15 an hour in Washington, D.C. probably makes sense. Does it make sense in Woodside, Delaware? I don't know, but what does it do when you make a $15 an hour wage in Camden, Delaware, or the backside of Odessa? What you do is you set the floor, and then what do? You already know this. Everything else gets leveled up. Now, I don't know if that's a good or bad idea, but I do know it comes with a cost. Right on? Thanks.
One of the things that Senator Buckson is referring to, you want a specific cost-saving measure. Look at school construction. So Smyrna School District, we just went through a referendum. Apo goes through a referendum, every other day? So if you look at school construction, one of the main costs in school construction is labor costs because of prevailing wage. If we would just reform prevailing wage for only school construction, taxpayer dollars would stretch further on the local share, and the state share in the bond bill would stretch millions further. If you kept asking for specific examples, and
the flip side is those workers would make less money.
Those workers would not make a Philadelphia wage to be working on a school in Smyrna.
Understood. I want to move on to the next question, and it relates broadly. These all broadly relate to each other. This is about the healthcare industry has called for amendments to the Hospital Cost Review Board. They told me that they've been talking with the governor-elect, talking with members of the legislature about certain amendments, but I don't know which. But Brian Frazee did tell me that he was particularly frustrated with the review board's ability to effectively veto hospital budgets if they don't bring costs down. I think I'll throw it at you, House Speaker, first. Do you think that law should be amended? And if yes, why? And if no, why? And then we'll go down the line.
I'm going to be careful with my words because we are in the middle of a lawsuit right now.
That's true. That's true.
What I will say is that I think I know our priority will always be transparency and trying our best to tackle the rising healthcare costs while improving outcomes, right? And I've already said we're one of the highest in the country when it comes to health. Little old Delaware, one of the highest in the country when it comes to healthcare costs, and our outcomes do not complement that at all, right? So there's work that needs to be done. I am open to conversations around how we do that, ensuring that we are managing costs, ensuring there's transparency around that, improving outcomes. So I'm open to the conversations. I'm happy to sit at the table. I've been in contact with Brian already, and I'm looking forward to hearing what his recommendations are, what his proposals are.
And that part of the law that allows for that effective veto of hospital budgets without, if costs aren't sufficiently brought down, is that something that you would consider amending out of the law?
I don't know. I don't know what to say, because right, we're in a lawsuit right now, right? Anything I say right now is going to end up in the paper. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
I think it's also important
Please.
to note that that's a little bit of an oversimplification.
Please.
They do have the appeal right in
Right.
that law. So, there's other things that are factually in there that need to be recognized when you say part of it.
So that, I just want to clarify, so that effective veto can be appealed after? Yeah, understood, for sure. Would either Representative Spiegel or Senator Buckson want to address this?
Man, I hated that law. Whew. I'm getting encouragement from my left here. I despise that law. Look, I get it. I guess my bigger problem here, though, just from a 30,000-foot level, healthcare, the costs associated, the policies associated with healthcare is one of those things that's such a giant animal that it takes some big, heavy-duty, throbbing, sexy brains who focus specifically on that to try and solve the problem. Our healthcare bill focused just on the hospitals and how much they were charging, but it missed all of those other layers. Not necessarily the fault of the bill, but because in many of these instances I'm about to mention, we don't have the authority to tackle this. For example, if Christiana Care is charging you $35 for an aspirin, what we in the General Assembly see is, holy, $35 for an aspirin? That is way overcharged. Meanwhile, for all we know, Christiana Care is being charged $30 an aspirin by the healthcare middlemen providers. We don't know that, and those contracts are often proprietary, so we can't know that. So meanwhile, to turn around to Christiana Care and say you can't charge, essentially, $35 for an aspirin might mean Christiana Care, in order to cut the cost to get under that budgetary number, which of course is appealable, might have them taking a hit on the aspirin, and the middlemen healthcare providers now know that. Is that going to make them more likely or less likely to charge $40 for an aspirin?
So the assumption in that is that the costs to the hospitals in Delaware by those middlemen would be higher than the costs to the hospitals in Pennsylvania and other states. And I don't know, I haven't seen that. Are you asserting that that's the case?
Here's the quick thing. It's a good question, but a lot of those contracts are proprietary. It's difficult to know. The for-profit medicine, the federal government has been working on a truth in billing on medicine for the last 30 or 40 years. But again, there are contractual and IP, intellectual property things wrapped up in how much insulin costs. And that's been trying to be tackled by the federal government for years. What else am I missing? Across state health care. We're missing tort reform. We're missing all of these things that Delaware on its own may lack of doctors, lack of specialists, lack of technology, lack of people to build technology, lack of people who want to be doctors. All of these things affect healthcare costs, but the bill itself only said Christiana Care, and really it was focused on Christiana Care. Christiana Care, you are to blame for the healthcare costs. When in reality, there's all of these other things that the state may or may not be able to tackle that are oftentimes federal. They're oftentimes federally protected. They're wrapped up in interstate commerce. And so this bill, I thought, was tackling one of the many factors of healthcare costs, but didn't have the clout to tackle the other things. It's not a holistic approach to medicine. I mean, to cost control. It's a singular thing where you're treating one symptom without treating the problem. But treating the problem has proved elusive to the federal government as well. And so to do nothing was also problematic. I'm just not sure in the model of we have to do something, if this something that we did is the best route, especially with all of those other factors, which is going to need federal intervention, which, is it coming? Anybody have a line to the federal government to say, hey, are we going to get some of these things? Can we even get some of these things? Some of the things I've mentioned would get the federal government in court in the same way it got the state government in court. So, I don't know.
I think breaking down kind of what a lot of the proponents have told me, often in quiet, not so much on the record, is that they believe Christiana Care specifically is a monopoly or uses monopolistic practices in the state. Do you think that's the case?
Look, well, first of all, no, because where I am, in the area I am, is divided between two hospital systems. So it can't be a monopoly if there's two different hospital systems to choose from, right? When you get down into Sussex, you get more hospital systems to choose from. Now, if you're saying above the canal, hey, that's a different story. But you can't say it's a monopoly across the state if you're just then saying, oh, but wait, we just mean above the canal. So that's how I would answer that. And second of all, if that is indeed the case, then the true factor would be going through the Sherman Antitrust Act, not necessarily a bill that claims to tackle healthcare costs when it doesn't actually attack all of the healthcare cost problems.
Understood. Who else wants to jump in on this one?
I'll just speak. I'll say this: who doesn't want health care that's affordable, regardless of your economic status, right? As my wife continues to call me. The challenge I have is how we set about the course of dealing with that. So I was new to the Senate. What I do know about this bill, it had merits in its language, but I didn't understand what was being asked because it was dropped on us in March of last year, right? It passed through the House by suspension of rules. It ended up in the Senate and changed even leading up to the day of the vote. The argument that I made is kudos to the bill's authors. You have got the attention of the healthcare industry in the state of Delaware. I said this on the floor. Now that you've done that, let's pause. Lay this on the table. Let's get a table like the one here, and let's get these players in a room, and let's say, you figure it out or we're going to do it for you. And then they can help us effectively come back in January now and introduce laws that actually will do things that we look to do in the state, which is affordable health care and the costs associated with it. That's what I asked, because that's what made sense to me. This rush to do something, to say we did something, made no sense. So that's where I am.
Understood.
I'm sorry, just real quick, Senator Sokola and I was talking. The other one that I mentioned, that other big healthcare driver, is that, hey, we Americans are unhealthy, and we should take better care of our own health.
So you're right,
Speaker Brown.
and it's a multifaceted approach, right, in order to really address the rising healthcare costs. So you're right, we're not healthy. But how do we get people healthy? One of the main concerns was our Medicaid budget, right? Like, our Medicaid budget is driving our budget. And then I know last session, everybody was in an uproar about diabetes injectables, right? Oh my God, weight loss drugs are driving our budget. But what they didn't think about was people on the back end become healthier when they're no longer needing those chronic medications like diabetes drugs, hypertension drugs, high cholesterol drugs, triple bypass, open heart surgery, all the things, right? So you had a stroke, you're in the hospital, $10,000 a day, I don't know, it's expensive. So you have to pay on the front end to win on the back end. And I think that that's something that we really need to think about. We need to look at how do we focus on prevention, especially when it comes to the concern about Medicaid driving our budget and the cost constantly increasing. So, I mean, like I said, it's a multifaceted approach, but when we come up with legislation that focuses on prevention, it's gonna cost money. And when that legislation gets presented, we have to make sure that we have enough support to pass those bills, knowing that we're gonna have better outcomes. So Representative Spiegelman is right. And And the senator is right as well. So I look forward to your support when we work on some of those bills that focus on prevention.
She's saying that because we've already talked about it.
Senator Sokola, did you want to add anything?
You know, I just will remind people this is kind of modeled after what was done a number of years ago in Vermont. And we heard from the healthcare industry immediately how bad that was. And then we heard from Vermont, and it's not. It actually did put a little bit of a curb in the increasing costs in Vermont. It's similar to the idea that we have and has worked here in Delaware for the Public Service Commission around energy. You know, it's certainly not perfect, and we are willing to talk to people about amendments. You know, the interesting thing about a new law is it's a new law. And getting a law passed is one thing, getting it implemented is another thing, and getting feedback on what changes need to be done is a third thing. And we're responsible. We have to do those things, and I'm willing to. I know Senator Townsend and Representative Minor Brown worked hard on this, and I think that you know, it's a tool in the box that we didn't have, and I hope it's successful.
Understood. Moving on to another significant cost for households, electricity. And this is a question based on a lot of our reporting at Spotlight that I don't know if there is any active legislation, but electricity rates have increased significantly since COVID, according to federal data. They are likely to increase more, according to recent auctions, supply auctions that have been much higher than in the past. And then in addition to that, we have regionally, at least, we have projections for new data centers to support AI technology. We have this green hydrogen hub that calls for using a lot of our renewable energy to produce hydrogen. That will all tighten that crunch, that supply crunch. It'll eat up a lot of the production that we have. Is there anything that the legislature should do to insert itself into that industry, or to regulate that, to do anything in that industry to control what could be ever-increasing costs? Or is there anything that the legislature should remove? There's already a lot of regulations, I imagine. Maybe what?
We've actually made it worse. Cool. A couple years ago, we passed a bill that required 30% renewable energy portfolio. And that's great from an environmental standpoint, but it's also more expensive. I mean, green energy is more expensive. It's simply not as efficient as more traditional forms of energy. So it's kind of like, well, if we're going to have a 30% renewable energy portfolio, well, then you're going to get, on the other side, you're going to have more expensive energy costs. And that's a policy decision that you got to make.
But is that the case going forward? The costs of solar and wind have been dropping over the last 15 years, and I believe they're projected to continue to, especially with economies of scale and such. But go ahead.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. They've been coming down, and that's great, except at the same time, coming down from here and still being more expensive than here, well, that's great. That's progress, but you're still not here. I actually have clients, some of my commercial real estate clients, who have actually been contacted by the solar companies who are buying up significant amounts of farmland, buying up significant amounts of land in order to convert them into not solar farms, solar fields. We need to get away from that farm word. It's a solar field, not a solar farm, and Kent County in particular got in a little bit of trouble with that. But this is not an inexpensive proposal. The technology is getting better all the time, but it's still not quite there. And simply from a science point of view, and gosh, I love science, green energy is cool, and it's a bit of a stopgap measure. It's not going to propel the human species into the next phase of our evolution. And it's one of the reasons because of what you said. If we're really going to lean into AI like we are, we need more juice. And green energy doesn't really have the capacity to provide the juice inexpensively like we need to enter that next phase of human evolution, the next age. So there's other things that it could do. Hydrogen is a potential. Fusion technology is a potential. But all of these things, and I can nerd out if you want. I could spend the next 20 minutes nerding out on this. But these things are potentially the future of energy, even green energy, because of the capacity and the returns. You know, hydrogen fuel cells produce water. Fusion reactors are much safer than fission reactors and produce 10 times the amount of energy. All of these things are great, but they're all theoretical right now. So getting Delaware, the country, the world, to the next phase of our human existence, we're not going to do it with what we have now inexpensively.
And I don't want to get bogged down on this because we have 3 other lawmakers too, but why is that phase inevitable? Why do we have to move to that phase?
Why do we have to move to that phase? All right, so what we're saying is that right now is the maximum that human potential in terms of science and exploration and free clean energy, that right now is as far as we want to go, that there's no thought that humans ever want to have free unlimited energy, that humans never want to explore the cosmos, that humans are just kind of stuck here. That's not really within the human spirit.
I understand, and I was directing that question mainly to AI, but I think
AI
the
gets
answer
us
applies. Yeah, I gotcha.
I think you
guys.
asked the question whether or not the government should get involved with price setting or dealing with rising costs and electricity
Or
rates.
incentives in any way.
And my answer is no.
Okay, understood. Senator?
Yeah, I think we have an opportunity to be part of moving forward on energy. You know, we qualify for quite a few renewable energy credits by virtue of what we just did, the agreement with Maryland on offshore wind. It's a big plus for Delaware. We gain in a number of ways in that. The most expensive energy we have right now in Delaware is what? The Indian River Power Plant, which isn't creating any power, but it's costing $60 million or whatever it is, tens of millions of dollars each year to be ready to go on the grid in case there's a peak area. So it's only a peak performance thing and hasn't even been used in those circumstances. By far the most expensive energy we have. Also, if it is on, it's the most polluting energy. Coal pollutes when you mine it, when you transport it to the plant, when you burn it, and then when you dispose of the coal ash. So, and you know, we're building all these costs into things like wind and solar for the legacy, for what happens when it's done and everything like that. And coal hasn't had to pay for any of that, ever. You know, there was a, it's so ridiculous that we're comparing things that are incorporating all their costs. And solar, I mean, wind had come down so much, but then what happened? Interest rates went up. And so the bids that were coming in, assuming a 2% interest rate, now had to be readjusted because interest rates skyrocketed. They're coming back down. Hopefully they'll come down more, and those solar fields will be, or those wind fields will be done in a manner that they're already cheaper than any other form of energy. And nuclear, I remember when it was going to be too cheap to meter. They're now coming up with these new mini nuclear plants. I forget what they're called, but they're
Modular, I think.
Yeah, modular nuclear plants, and those are things that are still kind of in the experimental stage. If they work the way some scientists believe they will work, they will be a nice part of the solution. They will be something that can be done safely and cover, for instance, a data center. You know, and there's already talk of some of the data centers incorporating that type of power.
So I think I hear you saying we need more supply. Is that what the solution is? We just need a lot more?
You know, we need more supply. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't need. So if you have more insulation, if you transition to better windows, if you do the kinds of things that are more preventative, then you don't have to increase supply quite as much. But there's other things, like if you increase the supply of wind and nuclear and solar, and there's a time of day where you're not using all of it, and that use can be converted to electrolysis, so that you're converting water into hydrogen and oxygen, then you get the hydrogen for your hydrogen hub part, and that's just, you know, being created. There's green, red and brown, I guess, were the color codes in the hydrogen hub legislation. And green is if it's created using solar or wind. And the brown, I guess, is if it's nuclear, or no, if it's
pink, it's nuclear. I think it's blue is natural gas.
Pink is nuclear, and the brown is if it's like from a landfill or something, because there's
biogas.
hydrogen.
They color-coded it in crayons for us legislators.
Yeah, they did.
Can I ask
Please.
I just want to be clear, as a Republican senator, maybe representing my caucus, I don't know. I personally am not offended at all by green energy. I believe in a diverse portfolio. I've voted and shown that. My challenge is what we started the conversation with, government intervention to mandate the existence. It looks really good on paper, but it comes with a cost. It just simply does. And you have to be willing to look at what is it that is a known, remember what I said, I known versus what I think. And a lot of what we do is build it on what we hope happens. And if it doesn't happen and it doesn't work out the way we hope it does, what ends up happening is we come to you for more money to make it work. That's just the way it works. Now, you might say it's worth the cost to save the planet and go all green. I'm not going to debate with you on that. You decide. But don't ignore the fact that if these hopes don't work, right, if they don't come to fruition, there is a cost associated. We mentioned the Indian River plant. As I understand it, the reason that coal doesn't participate is because coal's been told to go away. And the reason that the billions of dollars in investments to bring that plant up to the next 100 years is because they recognize that in the state of Delaware. So they refuse to invest in the company down there. And we're told, well, listen, fine, don't invest, go away, but at least keep this thing alive. That way, if the state doesn't maintain its energy performance, we've still got you to turn the switch on and save us. Now, that didn't come from me. I'm a retired gym teacher. That comes from the folks that are in that space that I sat with and said, coach me up on this, because I'm not opposed to green energy. So there you go.
Understood. I'm going to move on because we are getting short on time. I'm not going to get through all my questions. Let's jump to what I see as an interesting one. There were two powerful allies of unions, specifically the Building Trades Union, the AFL-CIO, elected officials, Bethany Hall-Long, Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall-Long, and Valerie Longhurst, who lost in the previous election cycle. Do you think organized labor is going to have the same power this legislative session as it had in really decades past, with a new governor, with those two individuals not in Dover any longer?
It's an interesting, you see these things happen all the time where somebody or multiple people lose an election who happen to have been supported by one entity or another. And I think it's a risk to draw a conclusion that that's the reason that they lost. There are other variables that were at play in both of those cases, I think, and sometimes things just happen because that was the time and how all the variables correlated around the elections. I am still a supporter of organized labor. Always have been. I support prevailing wage for state projects. I think that we should have people get a fair wage for a fair day's worth of work, and I want them to be able to have opportunities for the future. I want them to have health care. I want them to be able to buy a house and a car, and hopefully an electric car, and and get their kids either to higher ed or to credential training or whatever it is, so that they could have a good career going forward. But
will that presence with the current administration and those two individuals no longer in Dover, will it have the same oomph? Will organized labor be able to push through bills like they have in the past?
Well, they haven't always been able to push through the bills that they wanted.
Sure.
And I've been there when there were bills that were introduced by Jack Walsh, and we got some feedback, and we met with them and talked about, okay, is there another way we can do this? Is there can we phase this in or something? And there's always going to be a process that involves stakeholder involvement and stakeholder engagement, and they're still a stakeholder, and so they're still going to be part of the process.
Understood. Speaker, can you address that question, Hunter Brown?
I don't really want to. I support organized labor. My hope is that we all come to the table and have a conversation about how we can support each other. Because, you know what? Politics is politics. Okay, I hate politics. I do. I'm here for the greater good of Delawareans, and that's it. And when it comes to the political sticky stuff, it does get really sticky and it can get dirty. But at the end of the day, if we are doing the work of the people, then we shouldn't allow that to get in the way of it. So we want to make sure people have good jobs. We want to make sure people can keep their head above water. We want to make sure that people can afford to live. And I know that that is the mission of our labor unions. So what I would like to see, and this is my hope, and I'm pretty sure that our new governor would most likely be supportive of, is coming to the table and having a conversation about how we can all work together to uplift Delawareans.
Gotcha. Your colleagues across the aisle.
Less than 10 minutes,
I
Matt's
see.
going to be here, governor's going to be here, so
Yeah.
until then, you could ask him that question. I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough.
In fact, you're asking me a lot of
That's my job.
So I just, again, clarifying, as a Republican senator, I support union. Absolutely. I was a union member for 28 and a half years. I left the union because of one reason. They lost their focus, in my opinion. We went from workplace and supporting our workers to taking on social aspects and representing me in a way that I didn't feel comfortable with. So as long as the unions are presenting themselves for exactly what I believe, right, my thoughts are that we protect the workers. We advocate on behalf of the workers for better wages and health care and conditions and those types of things, then I'm all in. The challenge is there has to be balance. There has to be space for both sides of the issue. The very first significant vote I had as a senator 2 years ago was in the mini bond. And it had to do with a pilot program that was stuck in there. And I say placed in there. And it was my indoctrination of what is this? What are we talking about? It was basically creating a program that forced labor into state contracts for this one, mini type of pilot program. And what happened the next time when we got to vote on it was the place was filled up with folks, a diverse community of folks. And I mean, when I say diverse community, I'm talking about folks of all races, genders, whatever you want to talk about. They're opposing the legislation because it would impact what they do. And that allowed me to say, okay, there's got to be balance. I knew it, that helped convince it. So I hope to answer your question by simply saying this. There needs to be balance. I always say this. It's okay, I think, as a representative of a union to once in a while go back to your membership and say, hey, man, we're good. We're good. The state's been good to us. We're good. Let's ride this out, move on to the next one. But it seems like that the leadership has to, or is somewhat required to, always advocate for more. I get that, especially at a time in our country when more was really needed. But there is a balance between how much it costs to build a school, right? Versus how much can we afford as a state of Delaware. Because when you keep escalating those costs, again, it gets back to the folks I'm looking at. We have to come back to you for more money.
And I want to sneak in one last question before we finally close out, and that is about the Port of Wilmington, which is also related to labor. It's a base of good paying blue collar jobs. There's been a project, you guys all know, to build a second container terminal at Edgemore. They had their permit to dredge the water. A federal court recently last fall said, no, you no longer have that permit. It was done wrong. We as in state government have committed roughly $200 million to that build. What's the status now? I mean, anybody who just, I'm just fishing. Where are we with that? Where's that $200 million, and where are we with the status of Edgemore?
That ruling is under appeal, and so.
Who has appealed it? The Army Corps hasn't appealed, as far as I know.
My understanding is there's a process that they have to go through. We do not consider it to be final. There's still a possibility that we will have a container terminal at Edgemore.
Okay. Okay. My understanding was, so the state and the Diamond State Port Corporation had a motion to intervene in the case, and they were denied. So my understanding was it has to be the Army Corps, which was the defendant in that case, that must appeal that. I don't think they have, but maybe they haven't. I haven't seen it. You guys.
Those things take time to put together,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes an appeal. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be appealed the very next day. They probably have to get their ducks in a row, and then that process will.
But it is your understanding that the Army will appeal it? The Army Corps will appeal it, or?
The last I talked with Secretary Bullock
Mm-hmm.
was that they do not consider the decision closed. That they don't consider everything final right now. They feel
Understood.
like there's a path forward, and they're cautiously optimistic. So.
Okay. Who else wants to jump in on that?
What he said.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right. I think that sums it up. Yeah.
To back up Senator Sokola, I think part of the decision that was handed down was that the initial application was done somehow incorrectly. And so, to your point, I think in order to get all the ducks in a row to make sure that it's correct, we're still within the window to make that appeal, even if it hasn't been formally appealed. I think is
I could have missed. It could be an appeal, or it could be a refiling for the
Yeah,
steps
yeah,
forward.
they could refile the same application, my understanding is. That would be a years-long process, is again my understanding, but, yeah. Okay.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, so I think Senator Sokola and I would like to talk to you about our thoughts on the Eagles.
Okay. No, I would like to just end it with each of you. I mean, we got 4.5 minutes, and we don't want to go over with the governor on, but if each of you can take just about a minute and tell me what your priorities are for the next session. Let's start in the end with Senator Buckson.
Thank you. First of all, it's an absolute honor to be in front of you folks. And listen, if anything that I said challenge your thoughts, it's an open invitation to come talk to me. I am absolutely willing to sit, listen to your thoughts and ideas, and see where maybe I got it right or wrong. So that's a good thing. My priorities, I always start with education. I think education, if we get better in that arena, bleeds into everything else that we're doing. So that would be the priorities for me, looking at things, at initiatives that deal with education and getting along. You know, here's the thing, I'll say this, and it was a stat that was presented to me at the Farm Bureau, believe it or not. 80% of the time, we're unanimous in our votes when it comes to legislation for Delawareans. 70% of the time, it's bipartisan, right? So that means maybe, especially me, I tend to be the guilty one voting alongside of some of my colleagues on bills. But there's more than just a majority vote. So it's that small percentage there, 20%, that we end up fighting over and gets in the paper. But there are a lot of times when we get along and we figure things out. So, you know, there's hope in that arena, and that's what I'll bring. I have a lot of initiatives, but I'll end with that.
Thank you, Senator Buckson. Speaker Miranda Brown.
I think right now, my priority, and I believe for my caucus as well, is just to really protect and preserve the progress that we've made so far. We're really just thinking through how do we really improve the cost of living for Delawareans. Like I said before, people are struggling, and that encompasses so many things, right? Affordable housing, healthcare, education, childcare, workforce, right? So again, holistic approach here. So the goal is to hopefully not have to increase taxes, but still find a way to ensure that we are improving the cost of living of Delawareans holistically, supporting our budget, knowing most likely we're probably going to lose some federal funding coming down the pike, right? So we need to keep that in our minds as we move forward and just be extremely fiscally responsible to ensure that we're not overburdening Delawareans any more than they already are overburdened. So that's where I am.
Thank you. And Representative Spiegelman.
So 3 things. First of all, I'm new to this leadership thing. So you asked about priorities. I just like to do well by that. I mean, this is something that's new for me. I don't really know what to expect. So I would just like to do well by the state, just being in a leadership role. Number 2, and this was started about 10 years before I was elected, wouldn't it be nice for you to get direct shipment of alcohol? Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? And number 3, ladies and gentlemen, Jalen Hurts returned to practice today.
Yay.
Thank you, Representative. And Senator Sokola.
It's really hard to beat that really positive response we got to this panel and Deshaun Jackson today. But yeah, and thank you for having this. I think it's important that we are open and transparent and inclusive, and I plan to continue that process. I'm delighted that some of my colleagues are here today. I see Tizzy Lockman, and I know that you heard from Russ earlier. I did want to say one thing, and it builds on something that Eric Buckson said. He talked about it starts with education. You heard from Rob Coote earlier. Rob was Commissioner of Corrections at one point in time, and at that point in time, I was Chair of Education. Jack Markell was governor, and he had an initiative about the first 3,000 days, first 8 years. And among all of the stakeholders that were there, Health and Social Services, Kids Department, educators, Rob Coop was there as Commissioner of Correction. And I said to him, I don't know if we could go into any other state where the Commissioner of Corrections would be at an important meeting like this. And he said the same thing Eric said. It all starts with education, and education starts with birth. And I think, you know, it's sad to see him go. Hopefully we'll have somebody that good coming into his place in that space, and hopefully we'll continue to have people who understand how important that is. 4, 3, 2.
And we're done.